Everyone, we'll get started in about 1 minute. All right. Morning or afternoon for most of you. I'm Matt Hanlon. Welcome to your T3. We've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So I think we're waiting for 8. But we'll start to kick things off anyway. All right. Let me share my screen. And we'll just kind of remind everybody where we are. Okay. We'll give people another couple of minutes to jump on because I know we're waiting for a few. So we just give them 2 minutes. So if you want to just unmute yourself, Didi, and I hope I'm saying that right. You're coming from Thailand. I know we've got people from Singapore on the call. We've got folks from the Apple Developer Academy in Saudi Arabia. We've got folks from Uzbekistan and Kazakhstan. Do you want to just unmute yourselves, put yourselves on camera? Now we'll do full introductions later and just say hi.
Hi everyone, I'm
Hello,
Paul
everyone.
from Malaysia.
Nice to meet you.
Hi, I'm Titi from Thailand.
Nice to meet you.
Hello, Matt. I'm from Uzbekistan.
Nice to meet you. And you say your name Berdior?
Berdior, yes.
Berdior. All right, excellent. Definitely, if I mispronounce anybody's name, correct me. I'm an American. We are the absolute worst for anything other than, John or Bob. So definitely correct me. All right, well, look, tell you what, we'll slowly get things going. The first part of today, we're going to talk a little bit about how this week is going to work in pretty solid detail, just so you have an idea for what's going to happen. It gets pretty simple after today. It's going to be a lot of not me talking. It's going to be one of you presenting back lessons, and then the rest giving feedback on those lessons. It's going to be super important that we have lots of engagement. And I'm going to show you some of the tools that we're going to use over the course of the week that I, of course, use for T3s all the time, but I also use them in my own classroom. So there might be something there that you find interesting. Now, most of my classes have been done for the last 2 years, all online. So, hopefully you're lucky enough to be in the classroom pretty regularly. This is what the week is going to look like. We're going to start off with a little just welcome and introduction, some sample lectures from me. I'm just going to show you kind of what we expect and try to set it up with the simplest lesson, the very beginning, Intro to Swift and Playgrounds. So we'll go through that lesson. I'll show you another Xcode lesson and remind you of a few things that we want to focus on when we're presenting with Xcode, because everybody did get at least one teach back where it's probably best shown with a demo. So we'll go through that, what it should look like. Then we'll get into the infrastructure check, and I'll tell you what that's about in just a little bit. But that's going to be the workshop piece where everybody takes a turn presenting, making sure that you can share your screen, make sure that you know how to work Keynote, that you can play a Keynote file, and all the rest. So that's coming up at around roughly usually 10 o'clock, maybe a bit earlier. And then that's it. Then we're going to start right off with the teachbacks. We do have 8 folks on the call today, or we're supposed to have 8 folks on the course this week. So that's kind of a lot, because each lesson takes roughly half an hour, with feedback, maybe a little bit longer. So it's tough to fit them all in sometimes. So we want to make sure that we have plenty of time. So that's why we start our teachbacks today. At the end of today, we'll have a closing a little bit early, and we'll just talk about the next steps. But then it is all teachbacks all the time. Tuesday, Wednesday, even Thursday morning, we'll do a bit of teachbacks. Anything we haven't gotten to at that stage, we'll cover on Thursday morning. And then we'll also have a little discussion of the labs, and I'll tell you what that means. There's a little description on the Miro board, but we'll talk a little bit more about that, and that's if time permits. After all of that, what we'll do is we'll take a little break on the Thursday, and we'll have a Teaching Swift discussion. So that's a roundtable where all of us stop sharing our screens, and we just talk about how you're teaching Swift at your institution, or how you're planning on teaching it at your institution. This is an interesting one because we'll hear from people from all different places and places with different ways of teaching that you might have, just to see how this material can be deployed or how you're thinking of deploying it. It's a great place to get ideas for how to run your own classes in the future. We'll probably also have time for an app design workbook session, where I'll just take you through the app design workbook. It's mentioned in the book. It's an amazing resource, and I use that in my class all the time. In fact, we're setting it up for a local secondary school here for their transition year students. They're going to go through an app design process, and it's a really great tool to use for all sorts of students, never mind people who know how to code. So that's the flow of the week. Once we get through today, thankfully, I do much less talking, and it's all over to you, and you get to do all the talking and presenting of all the stuff that you've been assigned this week. So today specifically is going to look a bit like this. So as I mentioned, we'll have our sample lecture on Intro to Swift and Playgrounds. I'll give another little sample lecture on building, running, and debugging an app, and also show you where to get some of the scripts that you might use for the other SDK lessons. And then we'll get into our infrastructure check. Throughout the whole week, we'll have loads of breaks scheduled in so we can go up, stretch our legs, get another cup of tea, cup of coffee, and come back to the camera. So any questions about the schedule? All right, excellent. So one thing we're going to do is, and I think I have this one up to date. I'm almost positive I do. You are going to go and download the peer evaluation form because I'm going to walk you through some of the logistics of this week because there are a couple things that are expected of you. So there's the peer evaluation form, and there's also this link to the Miro board. These are two of the main tools that we're going to use throughout this week. So let me cover the peer evaluation form first. So I'm going to get out of the presentation. Let's pop over to here we go. Okay, so if I go look at the peer evaluation form, that's this. I just pasted the link into the chat. It's a numbers file. I'm going to hide the format there, make it a little bit bigger. So you're going to download this now, and you're going to fill this out for every single teach back that you see. First thing you're going to do is, of course, put your name on there. If I've misspelled your name, I took them off the registration form, but if I misspelled your name, let me know. I can go correct it. You can download a new copy. Select your name, and then as a person is presenting, you're going to go select the instructor name. So imagine Mubarak is presenting first. You would select the lesson that they're presenting. And then you're going to rate them on a few different categories. And we have a comments field. Now, I actually feel that the comments field is the most valuable piece that we can fill in. That's where we're going to make notes about, oh, I really liked the analogies you used. So or maybe so this is advice that you can leave to your fellow T3 attendees that they'll get to take away with them. Because what will happen with these peer evaluation forms is you'll fill them in at the end of the week. We'll say, okay, cool, everybody's going to go away. You'll email them back to me and to Brenda, who'll be joining us on Wednesday. And then I'm going to take all of these forms and compile them into an evaluation report for each and every one of you. So all of these comments will actually get shown and compiled into that report so that you'll be able to go back and look at your evaluation report later and see the comments that people left for you. Like, I really like the analogies you used in that lesson. Maybe talk a bit slower. I still have the evaluation report that I got however many years ago. And I still have to follow that advice. There's advice like take a breath, use less words, talk slower. So I find it really helpful going into a class like this or a class where I'm teaching Swift to just go over and say, oh yeah, actually, what hit really well with an audience like this was that analogy I used for optionals. So this is really important that you leave some good comments here and constructive ones. And also keep in mind that the person you're writing about will see these. So of course, be nice. I don't think we've ever had anybody write any nasty comments in the peer evaluation form. But this is a great place to provide feedback and really help a fellow educator improve their lessons. It's rare that we get this kind of feedback from people who are also teaching on our lessons. For these categories here, there's a comment at the bottom, and in fact, I probably should explain the categories in the bottom, but we'll get to that. You're rating people on a scale of 0 to 5. Represents Apple. Doesn't mean that they're wearing an Apple T-shirt and have the Apple hat and everything else. It's more that they did a really good job with the materials. We didn't go off the beaten track too much. We stuck to. I mean, this course is all about Swift and programming for iOS. We're not going to try to bring in, especially in these lessons, too much about Android or Windows or what have you. Now, if you're teaching students who have a background in React Native or some other programming environment, it's fair to go make those comparisons. represents Apple. This is usually a very easy one to get a good score on, so long as you're not like, oh, Swift is lousy. I miss it when we had Objective-C, and that's usually an easy one to grade people on because we're teaching all about Swift and iOS programming. Interacts well with students is you're rating them on how well during the lesson they're reaching out and giving students an opportunity to engage with them and with the material. This means, did they ask questions that the students would be able to answer? We can't ask impossible questions that we haven't covered yet, or we can, it just wouldn't be very effective. But are they asking questions that they've given the students enough information that they can either infer the answer to the question, or they know it, they just have to recall it. So that's interacts well with students. So that's making sure that we're not just presenting at them and just giving them a fire hose of information, but we're also just checking along the way to make sure they understood it. Presentation skills just is a rating of how well you can drive Keynote. Did you feel really comfortable presenting with Keynote? Were you able to present it full screen or as close to full screen as you can get? Were your presenter notes good enough that it seemed like a natural conversation you were having with the audience? Communication of key ideas, that you're going to rate people on how well they told us why are we learning about constants, variables, and data types. Why are we learning about loops? Some of those will be harder than others. Some lessons it's really hard to get the why, especially if a lot of you are experienced programmers or computer science teachers. You've been doing this for a long time, so of course we know why we do loops. It should be self-evident. Not so much for the beginning coder. That's also going to depend again on your audience. If you're teaching doctorate students who've already been doing this for a long time, you don't need probably to tell them why as much. It is more telling them how. How does it work in Swift? Organization and preparation, I think that's relatively self-evident itself. Just how well you know the material, how well you've prepared your lecture. Have you rehearsed it? You can always tell if people have rehearsed it or if they're just winging it. So that's going to get you a better score. Obviously, if you spend a bit of time, you've read through the supplemental material, and you've even worked up a few examples maybe. Knowledge of subject matter. Again, if you've read the material and you've practiced with it a bit, you should have no trouble getting a 5 on that one. You don't have to be the world's greatest expert on Swift. Even if you know where to point students when you get asked certain questions, that's a huge piece of knowing the subject matter. And lastly, the ability to answer questions. This is where everyone else comes in. So it's very important that at the end of each lecture, we're going to pause. I'm going to say, okay, great. Does anyone have any comments, questions, or feedback? That's when the people who've been watching the other person present, it's your job to think of the questions that your students might have for that lesson and to put them to the person teaching. It's not, you're not trying to make life difficult for them. You're actually trying to make life easier for yourself down the line by anticipating questions that your students might have and seeing how someone else might handle it. Even if you know the answer, it's still, there are no dumb questions here. So I would like everybody to make sure that they've got some questions or comments or feedback prepared to give out loud to the lecturer after their teach back is done. Then I'll usually ask for some self-reflective feedback, and I'll talk about that in the peer evaluation form in a second. And you'll say, oh, yep, I feel I could have prepared better. I didn't have a lot of sleep last night. Maybe I've been fasting all day. It makes it much more difficult to teach. And then I'll give some feedback and some sort of pre-feedback to help you on your next lesson. So that's the peer evaluation form. There's also another tab that you can go into. where you can fill out an evaluation of your own teach back. So if I were Mubarak and I was say, all right, cool, I taught constant variables and data types, I could have been more prepared, or actually, no, I was so prepared for this lesson. I thought my presentation skills were good. You can leave comments here. This is more for yourself, just to go back and, your notes on how did the lecture go, and what might I have done differently. I know I do something like this for most of my lessons. I usually take some quick notes at the end, usually on paper, saying, oh, you know what? I actually tried this analogy. It fell super flat. Maybe the audience wasn't ready for it. Maybe it was too inexperienced audience, or maybe they're more experienced than I thought they were. So they didn't need whatever information it was I was giving them. So that's the peer evaluation form. The key is really this first tab and making sure that you fill this out for each and every person that presents along the way. Any questions about the peer evaluation form? Excellent. And again, if I've spelled anybody's name wrong, please let me know. I'll upload a new version before we head off today, so to make sure that everyone has the right names in there. All right, so that's the peer evaluation form. Next up is the Miro board. Now we use this pretty heavily throughout the week. There are some links to the welcome keynote template that everyone should have downloaded by now. If you haven't, I would recommend you go download that now. There's a link to the peer evaluation form. So usually all the information that I'm presenting here in class, and I won't be presenting much more, is available here on the Miro board. You can leave comments, suggestions, etc. We've got a few from previous T3s that we've run, including a link to a video on how to use GitHub in your classroom, some links to the Apple Human Interface Guidelines and Apple Design Awards. An excellent video. If you do have time, I would highly recommend watching this lecture from Patrick Winston at MIT called How to Speak. Gives you some really good tips on how to present information. He does an amazing job. Unfortunately, he passed away shortly after that lecture. But it's really, really good lecture. Definitely worth watching. And I know we get a lot of questions. We'll talk about this a little bit more on Thursday. But I did building a NASA photo of the day app, which is a project from Develop in Swift Data Collections, which is the follow-on to Develop in Swift Fundamentals. But I re-implemented that one in Swift UI and Swift Playground. So we tried to modernize an old favorite. So it's just showing you how you can take the material that we're teaching now, Develop in Swift Fundamentals and Data Collections, and bring it kind of into the 21st century by using Swift UI and showing you how that they all still apply. A lot of the concepts that we learn still apply, even if we move on to Swift UI from UIKit. Okay, cool. This is the thing that we're going to be focused on all week. This is our list of presenters. I think we've got nearly everybody here. Maybe we're missing a few. But this is your assigned teach back. So here, Mubarak, and if I'm pronouncing your name wrong, please definitely correct me. We've got these 3 lessons: constants, variables, and data types, intro to UIKit, and classes. And the way we're going to work through this list is we're just going to go top to bottom. So we'll start off with this lesson on constants, variables, and data types a little bit later today. Then we'll go to operators, then to loops, then to strings, collections, operators, control flow, and another lesson on constants, variables, and data types. So you'll see that we also have things not in 100% the order in the book. So when you do go to approach a lesson like loops, we can assume that all the other stuff has been taught already. So we're not doing it in a linear fashion here. But we can imagine that if we were doing this in a classroom, we would have covered constants, variables, and data types, and strings, and all the rest before teaching loops. So the reason why I mention that is because we don't have to present it and say, oh, let me try to fill in all this extra information that we haven't covered yet. We can assume that we've already covered that material in the classroom. And the same thing is we want to be aware of where we are in the book. If we are in Interface Builder Basics, that's very early on, still in Unit 1. So even though we would have just gotten a lesson on auto layout stack views, that doesn't exist yet if we're teaching it in order. So when I'm teaching about Interface Builder Basics, I want to make sure that I focus on Interface Builder Basics because auto layout stack views is a much more complex topic that we'll get to. And in fact, in a lot of places in the course, and when you're teaching your classes, it makes perfect sense to say, do you know what? That's something that we're going to cover later. It may look a bit daunting on the screen. Don't worry about it. We're going to cover that when we get to Unit 3, Lesson 1, Optionals. So we do have a lesson or a session 4 with a question mark there. That's sometimes if we get through the 3 lessons. Back in the day, we used to have to teach nearly the entire book. We would teach and from fundamentals and data collections because they were all the same book. So you may have to teach a 4th lesson. You'll be given plenty of advance notice. You won't be surprised with, oh, hey, surprise, you're teaching structures tomorrow or later today. We'll give you a bit of notice before assigning another lecture to you. But usually we only really have enough time for the 3 each. Any questions about the teach packs you've been assigned or anything? Okay. You will note that I even have a sticky note here saying that you'll be expected to provide feedbacks and ask questions. This will also get noted on your own evaluation form. So when I'm filling it out, there is a piece there to say how well they interacted with the other students. That will affect the evaluation report. That's a great question. So 1 topic per day, and we have 30 minutes for each topic. So you may have to teach more than 1 topic in a day. The way the schedule works and the way the schedule looks is we have these slots laid out for teach backs. So what might happen is we might arrive on the Tuesday morning. You might teach the first lesson on operators, and then we might get through everybody else. And you might also have a lesson on auto layout and stack views. So I would highly recommend preparing the lesson that you have for sure that day, as well as maybe the next one. But oftentimes we get to that point where we're like, okay, cool. Let's we get to around displaying data or segues and navigation controllers, and we'll have a quick time check, and depending how many days are left in the week, we may say, okay, that's okay. We'll end maybe a half an hour, 45 minutes early some days. Now, I have said in the past that there is a 30-minute time limit on the lessons. Some of them are going to go a little bit longer. Constants, variables, and data types is a famous one for going a bit longer, just because there's so much material in there. Same thing with functions, can go a bit longer if we're taking our time and we have a new audience. Auto layout stack views, segues and navigation controllers, structures for sure will go longer than 30 minutes. There may be a point where I usually have a 30-minute timer running in the background, so I may have to cut you off. I don't like to do it because I know you all prepare so much for these lessons. But depending how squeezed for time we are later in the week, I may have to say, okay, 30 minutes, that's great. Is there anything else you'd like to share about what you were planning on doing? Any demos or anything? And then also, if you only take 10 minutes for something like loops or operators, depending on your audience, that could go way quicker. So it could be over in 10 minutes. There's no harm. You're not going to get docked points for that. So long as you've taught it well, you won't get docked points for taking less than 30 minutes. Does that answer the question? Okay. So yeah, the short answer I could have given is you may teach more than one lesson each day. Later in the week, if we do have time, I really like this segment. This is not something that you have to spend a lot of time preparing. It's definitely something that's useful to walk through before you discuss it. But on the Thursday, what we sometimes will do if we have time is each person will pick a lab from the following units and discuss it. So there's a great lab at the end of each one of these lessons, displaying data, controls in action, auto layout and stack views, and the rest. Really, really fun to run in class because they really drive home the concepts. So you can either show us how you've implemented it and some of the thoughts you might have using it in the classroom, or you can actually kind of walk us through the lab as if we were in your class and we were building it. So that's something for later in the week, and something once you're done preparing your lessons, this is something worth checking out. Down below, if you're looking for like supplemental material, now we don't have a lot for the first few lessons, but we do have some links to a script for auto layout and stack views, for example, if you're teaching that. Anatomy of a constraint, which is a really good read on auto layout and some of the underpinnings of that engine. There's a really great exercise called Celebrating You that uses a tab view in SwiftUI, but could easily be repurposed to show off the tab bar controller and that lesson from Unit 3, Lesson 8. Over here in sort of the third round of teachbacks, we also have links to the optional source code and a link to enumerations. So if you're discussing optionals or enumerations, both of these links are kind of interesting. And if you're talking about classes, sometimes we find that maybe it's not super clear from just the text on the slide what a hierarchy looks like. Sometimes I'll use something like this in my class just to illustrate this is how inheritance works, and this is why you'd use classes and implement subclasses like this. There's also a really good link off to the Swift language guide where it talks about the structures and classes, why we have the two, and the differences between the two as well. And I think that's about it on the Miro board. Any questions about the Miro board or anything? This is a great place. If you do have any questions, email's probably the best if you just shoot me an email through the one I use to communicate with you, or you can drop a note on the Miro board if you want to share something with everybody in that comments section. That would be great. All right, any questions about any of that stuff? I think we're in pretty good shape. Okay, cool. Well, let's go. I'm going to go off very quickly then. We'll hide Miro. This is the welcome keynote. This is what we're going to be presenting as part of the infrastructure check. So that'll be the piece coming up after the sample lectures. I'll be giving those in just a second. This is just to get you familiar with Keynote if you haven't used it before, using the presenter notes, going in here, changing the emoji. So if you haven't done that already, if you hit Command Control Space, that'll bring up the emoji picker. I warn you about using that in the classroom because then that's all you're going to get, messages from your students in emoji. So you go pick an emoji that just represents you or it's something you want to talk about. I've written some notes down here that I would talk about while I'm presenting this, which is a great idea for while you're presenting these. We can edit the keynotes that come with this material, edit those presenter notes as much as we like so that we can make sure that we're sticking to the right note. Just give us a little prompt about your experience with Swift or app development in general. And then you can change this or not, just to talk about, you know, where you're teaching and how ready you are to go on this T3. So that's the welcome keynote. All right. So nearly done. Nearly done with me talking. You'd be so relieved. Very quickly, I'm going to go into the first lesson here and give you an idea of kind of what we're looking for this week. So obviously, I'm going to grab the Keynote file that accompanies Introduction to Swift and Playgrounds. We can see we've got notes for just about everything. Now, I might leave notes for myself on this slide because maybe I'm not sure what I'm going to talk about there. But everything else has some notes. So I'm going to show you how we might work through something like this. So if I'm going to, in fact, I'm even going to play it in a window just to show you what this ideally should look like if this is your setup. Now I've got, like I've mentioned in the end user prep sessions, I've got two screens. I've also got a phone dialed in too, so I can see that you're seeing my screen. So I don't have to ask if you can see my screen. When I hit play, I want to make sure that this isn't really quite big enough. There's too much other distracting stuff going on the screen. So I want to make sure that this is as large as possible. And then I can go bring up the presenter notes by saying show presenter display in window. Now it's actually over the middle of the screen where my mouse is now, but you can't see it. So it might be blocking the view of the actual slide you can see, but I can see it over here on my phone. But I also have the presenter display, so it shows me the current slide, the next slide, shows me the presenter notes, and then even the whole list of thumbnails for the presentation. So we're going to kick it off. So in this lesson, we're just going to get our very first look at Swift, the programming language, some amazing tools that we have to help us out when we're writing Swift code. And if I'm teaching this to beginners, we're starting at the very, very basic. I might even tell them, hey, this is very exciting because this is the same language that professionals use to build iOS apps and put them on the App Store and make their living. So this is a huge first step. So first we'll go into a little history. Swift was introduced at WWDC, which is the Worldwide Developer Conference. It's sort of like Christmas for Apple developers. That comes in June every year. And it was announced in 2014 as a new modern language for writing apps for iOS and macOS. It was designed to replace Objective-C as the primary language for iOS and macOS, which a lot of people really liked that it's replacing Objective-C because maybe the syntax was a bit foreign and strange looking. To those of us who used it for years, we loved it, of course, but Swift is a great new addition to our programming tool belt. And because it's relatively new, it was designed to be easier than other languages to learn, to read, to write, and maintain applications. There's a lot more than just writing code. There's a lot of taking a look at what someone else has written or what you've written a few days ago and trying to figure out, okay, what does this code intend to do? What are we trying to accomplish with this code here? So as a modern language, they designed it with three main goals in mind. They wanted to make it safe, and we'll talk about safety in a second, because if you're new to programming and you're like, hang on a second, I thought I would be pretty safe behind my desk just tapping away at a keyboard. Why does a programming language have to be safe? We'll talk about that in a second. It was designed to be fast. It's got to run on phones. It's got to run on watches, embedded devices. So it's got to be an efficient language to use, both from a running point of view. So when someone taps on an app, we want it to be pretty responsive. So the language has to respond quickly and be able to be executed efficiently. It was also designed to be expressive, and this is one of the key features that's going to help us reading our code and other people's code after the fact. That just means that when you look at some of the Swift code that we're going to see over the next while in this course, it almost reads like an English language sentence. So you can kind of have a quick scan of it, even if you don't know the exact concepts being used, and say, okay, I think I have a pretty good idea what's going on here. This is hugely important for when we write a bit of code, we go off for a little while, and we come back and we try to read it again and remember, what on earth was I thinking when I wrote this code in the first place? So let's just talk for a minute about safety, because this is going to come up again and again throughout the lessons. We're going to talk about it in constants, variables, and data types, in functions and structures, all throughout this course. We're going to talk a lot about safety. And that just means that they designed the language in such a way that we have some bugs that happen all the time in programming, and have happened all the time. Something doesn't exist when we expect it to exist. Something is different than what we thought it was going to be. Maybe we thought that we were going to be working with numbers, and then all of a sudden someone typed in the word John instead of a 4 that we expected. And in the past, these type of things might cause a serious crash in our application. And that just means you may have done it yourself. You may have been using your iPhone, tapping away in your app, working away on something, and then it just goes away and you're looking at the home screen. Well, a crash happened in the background. So Swift has been designed with a few things in mind, like some of the things on the screen here. And some of them may sound bizarre, and type inference and explicit object types and all that. By the time we're done with developing Swift fundamentals, we can go back to this slide and you'll say, oh, wow, I know what every single one of those things is. And I understand why I would use it and why it's important. So these are all just features to help us write programs that are going to be much less prone to crashing and losing people's data, and make our lives as developers so much easier, because it can help us avoid problems that we might have run into and spent ages pulling our hair out trying to figure out what's going on. So that's what it means by a safe language. So one exciting thing about Swift is that as a language is it was released as open source in December 2015. This just means that there's community input and support. There's a roadmap for Swift that they publish, which is sort of rare if you've been following Apple for a long time. Normally, we kind of play things close to the vest. But by having this open source, it means that the language is constantly evolving and improving. And there's been support added for more platforms over time. So if you're writing a server-side component, there's a whole server-side Swift effort on swift.org. There's a Windows port, there's a Linux port. You can run your Swift code as an AWS Lambda if you're familiar with that kind of stuff. So this is a huge development in iOS programming, because now you're not just limited to Apple platforms. We can start to look at transferring our skills in knowing how to build code with Swift over to other platforms. And we can go take a look at swift.org to learn more. But right now, we are going to do one of the most basic programming exercises. In any new programming language you encounter, one of the first things you learn typically is how to get the language to print the statement, hello world. So we're going to do that with Swift now. So when we're writing Swift code, it's a plain text file that we're writing this code into. We can put one or more statements in the file. Unlike some other languages like Objective-C, there's only one file for the code and the definitions for how that works. If you're coming from Objective-C or from C, you might be familiar with the concept of headers and implementation files. All of our implementation and any of the information about this is how my code is constructed, that's all done in the one Swift file. So right now we're going to take a look, and you can follow along at how to write the simplest application in Swift. Now the instructions on the screen are a little bit outdated. So let's go take a look. Let's actually run through this. You can follow along if you like. And if you are doing lessons like this, I would highly recommend making sure your students know if they're intended to follow along and actually try to do the steps that you're doing. If that's the case, we got to go much slower because they've got to take time to go find it. And when they look up, we don't want to be off on the next step. Or you can say, actually, do you want, just watch what I'm doing and we'll have time to practice this later. So I'm going to open up the terminal. Now, if you don't have this handy, what you can do is hit Command Space to bring up Spotlight and start typing in terminal. It'll usually be that first result. Now, mine might look a little bit differently than yours because I've just got a different theme applied to it. And I've also got the font bumped up. In fact, I'm going to bump it up even more. I can hit Command Shift Plus. That'll make the font a bit bigger. Super important, especially when we're doing these demos over WebEx. It can be really hard to see what's going on the screen. Or even if you're on a big screen in a lecture hall, make sure you bump up that font. So to write our first line of Swift code, we have the terminal open. If you've written any code in Python or Ruby or any number of programming languages, you might be familiar with the terminal. I'm going to type in Swift REPL. And REPL just stands for read eval print loop, because it'll read the statement that I've written, it'll evaluate, and then it'll print it out, and then it'll be ready to evaluate the next line. And so our simplest program to get Swift to print hello world, well, this is where we can see that Swift is kind of expressive. And in fact, I'm going to get really fancy. Instead of hello world, I'm going to say hello T3. You'll notice I don't need any semicolons. I hit return. It says hello T3. So if I were doing this in a classroom, I would probably have students follow along with this one and just try to make sure it works. If I were in an actual classroom, I might then walk around and just check to make sure everyone's getting on okay. Now, I don't want to leave you just there, because the most frustrating thing is when we get into a state and we can't get out of it. So the way to get out of this, once we're done writing our Swift code here, we could write a lot more, is we hit quit, and that gets us out of the Swift REPL. Okay, so that's one way to write Swift code. It's kind of fun, kind of exciting, makes you feel a little bit geeky because you're using the terminal. You feel like a real hacker. But we actually have some tools that are amazing for writing Swift code that can give us a huge leg up. So what we're going to do is we're actually going to use this tool called Xcode Playgrounds. Now, you might be familiar with Swift Playgrounds. That's an app that lives on your iPad and now on the Mac. That's a slightly different thing. And we're going to use Xcode Playgrounds throughout this Develop in Swift Fundamentals course. And I'm going to show you some of the cool key features of it that it shares with Swift Playgrounds on the iPad. But this is using Xcode, which is the professional IDE that coders use to build real iOS apps that live on the App Store. So we'll go through this in just a second, but this is the set of steps that we're going to follow to create our own Xcode playground and do the same thing we just did with in the terminal. So I'm going to hide this and we can actually walk through it. So I'm going to open up Xcode. I'm going to go up to File, New, Playground. And we'll have loads of practice with these two here. We'll create a new playground. I have the option to do iOS or macOS. I'm going to choose iOS because that's what this course is focused on. And I'm going to make it blank. Of course, the first time we open this up, every student picks game, but we're going to stick with blank. We're just going to save it on the desktop. We'll call it April T3 Playground. Now I can see that there are files here. Now for this playground, I don't need to worry about these. So I can actually hide these. This is called the navigator pane over here. And there are lots of different ways to navigate our projects that we'll see when we get into Xcode and we start building projects. But for now, I don't need that when I'm working in Playground. So I'm going to actually tap this to hide the navigator. I'll make this a little bit bigger. In fact, I'm going to change my settings. I think I changed them back. So I'm going to go up to Xcode settings. So when you're demonstrating something in Xcode, I would highly recommend you use either presentation or presentation large so that it's easy for us to see the text that you're typing. That's in the themes tab. So we have a bit of code here. We can ignore what that is. This is our very first lesson. We don't have to worry too much about import or what that means. We have a var greeting equals hello playground. We can sort of guess what might be going on there. But I'm going to write the same code that I wrote in the terminal. So I'm going to start typing print. And as I do, I have this list of autocomplete items. Now, some of them are a bit, I have no idea what's going on here. So it might be a bit intimidating when that first comes up. But this is going to be a huge time saver when we get later in our programming career because we don't have to type out everything. It's so easy to mistype something. And now I can just tap on something and it auto completes the whole thing. All the braces are in the right place for me. And we're good to go. So I'm going to start typing in hello, and I'll do the same thing I did in terminal. Now, right now, Xcode is just waiting. So like I said, this is the professional development environment that we're going to use to build our apps. This is the editor pane. We saw the navigator pane over here. This is the preview pane, which shows up in Xcode Playgrounds. And if I go down here to this play button in the corner, I can tap and hold on it and have this automatically run. This is really interesting when we're learning how to code because what'll happen is we have that button set to automatically run. Xcode will take a look at my file and my code as I'm writing it and will evaluate each and every line. So we can see over here, it evaluates this line. I'm not printing anything out, but it tells me that it stored this value hello playground in this greeting variable. And when I print out Hello T3, it shows up in two places. It shows up in the preview pane, and then it also shows up down here in the console that I can hide by hitting this button here, or show by hitting that button. So this is a really powerful environment to be working in. And I love using Xcode Playgrounds because it gets us familiar with Xcode and how it behaves. Because there's a lot of stuff going on in Xcode. It is a professional development environment. It caters for so many different types of programmers and building different types of apps that it's so easy to get lost. So this is just our chance to get practice using it. And it gives us immediate feedback here. So when I write the next line, I can also start typing greeting. It'll also autocomplete code that I've defined myself. So this is huge, and this is a much nicer way than the terminal makes you feel very cool, like you're a hacker breaking into somebody's system. But this is a much easier way to write your code, and it's the way most professional developers do it. So that's Xcode Playgrounds and our very first app. We've written our first bit of code in Swift. If you were following along, congratulations. Now you're a Swift coder. What we're going to do now is open up and complete the exercises in the lab for this lesson. And then we'll move on to the next one. So this is usually where we'd end each lesson with something like that. Like, okay, cool. We'd go and open up the lab. If I were in a classroom, I'd walk around and make sure people were getting on okay with the lesson. In this T3, this is the point at which I'll come back and I'll say, okay, great. Any comments, questions, or feedback from the group? And that's when you'll provide loads of feedback for your peers who are presenting. Then I'll turn and say, okay, well, how do you feel it went? Oh, you know what? Actually, I could have prepared a bit better. I could have had a better explanation for opening terminal together. And then I'll give some feedback as well after that and set you up for your next lesson. Any questions on any of that? How you're meant to present, the feedback, the questions, bouncing back and forth between Xcode and the Keynote file. Now, one useful note I'll make is that when you are presenting in a window, it is way easier to switch between a demo like the one that I just showed you with Xcode and with Terminal than if this were full screen and I had to exit out the whole thing and then come back into it. This saves kind of where you are. You can just hide it in the background by hitting Command H or going up here and doing Hide Keynote. So that's one kind of huge benefit of presenting sort of in fake full screen by making it as big as possible. Having your presenter notes right in front of you so you can look at the camera and at and your notes at the same time. That is a great question in the chat there. Do we need to talk all of the slide or can we edit the original slide? Great question. Since this course is all about these slides and this material, I would recommend not editing the slide. The only place that I would recommend or say, oh, it's okay to add something to the slide is here. If I close this, hide terminal. If we go look in Unit 2, in Classes and Inheritance, in Resources, usually I don't mind if people add something here like, for example, that diagram that we have on the Miro board, because this could be kind of awkward to read in the class. I know I teach this one to high school students a lot, and they're like, wait a second, the base class, that's the base class. Then you have a subclass, and then bicycles below tandem bicycles. So the order of these is a bit, it's not ideal. So usually having a diagram like the one on the Miro board helps explain, okay, cool, vehicle's a base class. It's also a super class. And then tandem bicycle is a subclass. Bicycle is both a superclass and a subclass because it's a subclass of vehicle, but a superclass of tandem bicycle. So it's all about the relation. So sometimes I would add a diagram to this, but I would recommend not making changes. If you do have any specific questions about the lesson that you're about to teach, definitely shoot me a note. I'm always open to people's ideas on what they're doing. If you have your own slides that you teach, maybe strings or something else by, you're not going to show those during your own presentation. But during that last segment, where we talk about teaching Swift on the Thursday, you're more than welcome to add your own slides there and just show them off. I always love seeing how people present the material. And in many different places where you lecture about Swift, people have developed their own because maybe they didn't realize they had these, or maybe their students learn a little bit differently. So hopefully that answers your question. Okay, now the last lesson I'm going to go through is so that was a Swift lesson, the intro to Swift and playgrounds. There's a little bit of demonstration because we talk about terminal, we talk about Xcode playgrounds. Sometimes you don't, there's no need to go off to Xcode playgrounds. That's usually a great tool to use if your students ask you questions about how something works. Usually I'll just go say, all right, well, let's try it. The other type of lesson that you're going to be teaching is that second round, the SDK lessons, things like interface builder basics. And as I mentioned in the end user prep sessions, there's a script here for us. So what I recommend you do is you would start here and play this keynote file, talk about, we have these common system views, a UI is built up from views. To build this, we use a tool called storyboards. I usually don't mention zip files because it just doesn't come up in the course, and why add an extra bit of information the students don't need just yet. And then it says here, demo this slide in the following slides. What I would do if I were presenting this is I would play this slide here, make sure it's big enough. I would play these slides, get to of course my thing's gone blank. I would get to this one, and then I would exit out of the playground, or out of the keynote, and then I would actually just demo them. I would go through all these steps it explains here. Review Xcode, add a label, change the label to name. This is a really good, well thought out set of steps to follow because it tracks exactly to the lesson, the way it's laid out, and does a really good job showing you the basics without going way overboard. At the end, we do have this bit of code that we write that might freak out some students, and they might be like, wait a second, what's add IB action? What's greet? What's underscore? What's this? But because this is so early on, usually I just say, hey, just trust me on this. We're going to just paste this one in. We'll learn a lot more about IB actions and what all this stuff means in Unit 2. And then by the time we get to Unit 3 and optionals, then we'll even understand what this is and why that might scare us a little bit, might not. And they do have a note here explaining that it's a force unwrap. I actually like to leave it until later and say maybe it's called a force unwrap, but we're going to tell you what that means later and why we're using language like that. So just a reminder, before we head off, the last sort of sample lesson then will be this. Here we'll go to Develop in Swift Fundamentals. This one is not assigned to anybody. Oh, I'm going to be having trouble with my screen, I have a feeling. Oops. So we're going to go to Building, Running, and Debugging an App, which is down here. Well, we're losing our connection here. So that's all right, though. So what I normally do for this lesson is I'll go through iBooks and show you a very simple debugging exercise, just to give you an idea of how we move through an Xcode-based lesson. So I would have given the lecture, if there were keynote slides, I would have given the lecture on it, and then I would have said, all right, well, let's walk through this. It's our very first time, or one of our very first times building a project. So I would go very slowly through this part, mention that we're picking an app and that we're in iOS. We'll call it first time debugging. We'll make sure this interface is storyboard and the language is Swift. We can explain what the other things mean. There's a first time debugging already there. We'll just replace that. This is where we can talk a little bit about the anatomy of an Xcode project and what's in each of these areas. As I mentioned, for the first lesson, I would make sure to go to Settings, Themes, and set your presentation style to large, or presentation at the very least. So the font's very big. Now you'll see that that doesn't help in cases like this, or when we're in Interface Builder. There's lots of little things to look at here. So I try to use tools like this to highlight where my mouse is on the screen. It's just a tool called Pro Mouse. But this lesson is all about code. And it's first time debugging. So what we do in this one is we don't worry about any of the extra stuff. I'm not going to talk about class or view controller or UI view controller, because that's for further down the line. But this is just to show you some of the capabilities of Xcode. Now, when we're doing our demo lessons, we want to make sure that we keep them nice and well paced, so not super fast. We want to make sure we're talking through as much as possible of these lessons. I know if you're a developer and you do coding for a living, it may feel really weird to talk about absolutely everything you're doing. But it's really helpful for the people watching you, because they're not going to be expert coders. So some of the stuff you're going to do is going to be very mysterious and a little bit like black magic. So we want to make sure that we're talking them through it. Now, in the example in the book, they use X as the variable name. We're going to learn when we get our lesson on constants, variables, and data types that is not a very good descriptive name for our variable, because we'll come back to it later and say, what on earth did I need to keep in this X variable? But this is going to show us all about, I'll do that as well. This is going to show us the different types of issues that we might run into in Xcode, that is. So I've written a little bit of code here. I've got a variable. Now at this stage, we've learned about constants, variables, and data types in the book, because it's lesson 1.7, I think, or 1.6. But what we can see here is this is the first type of issue we'll see in our Xcode project when we're writing some code. It's a yellow line. It's got a little triangle. When we tap on the yellow triangle, it gives us an option. for how to fix it, which is cool. But if I'm a beginner coder, I might look at this and go, oh my gosh, what is initialization of variable? My unused variable was never used. Consider replacing it with assignment to, and then this bit looks like an emoji, kind of an ASCII emoji, or removing it. And if I choose fix, the warning goes away. Now I have a warning for the next line because I'm doing the same thing. But our goal with this lesson is just to explain what some of these cryptic messages might mean. And this is just telling us that, hey, you declared a variable, you even gave it assigned it a value, but then you never use it. So this is an example of Swift trying to be helpful and safe. Because we've written this line of code, we never ever use this variable again. So maybe we want to remove it instead of replacing it with underscore. Because it's just extra visual clutter on the screen. That's going to make it harder for us to debug the real issue that we might have down the line. So to get rid of this issue, it won't hurt anything. I can actually hit the play button. It'll say build succeeded. It'll launch on an iPhone 14 Pro. If we're not having issues with our simulator here, let's try we've been running with let's try with an 8. I have a feeling I'm gonna have to restart Xcode here. So we wait a little bit. Now, this is another thing that you're going to want to note when you're doing Xcode demos. You might be running a project like this. You hit the play button. We've got to have loads of stuff to talk about. Then this pops up saying simulator device returned an error for the requested operation. We don't need to dismiss that in a panic. We can just say, okay, sometimes the connection between the simulator and Xcode get a little bit disconnected. So I'm going to do what any good tech person would do is they just restart. So I'll restart Xcode. I'll reopen up first time debugging. I'll try hitting play again. It should be pretty fast at that stage because it's already built. We haven't made any changes. This time the simulator pops up and our app is actually running. It's not very exciting because we didn't change anything in the user interface, but our app is up and running. So even though I had this warning here, I'm still able to build and run and launch this app. I can even put it on someone's device. Now, at Apple, we tended to not allow warnings. Anytime we had some code that we submitted, if there was a warning from the compiler that told us, hey, there's something up, we usually had to address it because those warnings were usually there for our own good. Now, so that's the first type. So not as serious. It's just a warning, not a major as issues go. The other type of issue we can see in Xcode is an error. So we'll do this. So we're going to get two different types of errors here, actually. Can anybody spot the difference between these two errors? Go ahead and put your answer in the chat. Can you see any difference between these two errors, other than the start of the text anyway? Go on, don't be shy. Is there anything we can spot? Even around this area here. Right, view did load is missing the parentheses, right? So that's the fix that we have to perform, yeah. So if I tap on these here, now this one, the whole text is actually written out for me. But if I tap on it, it's unlike the triangle that we just saw, and it won't pop up a bit of extra information about it. This one will. In fact, it pops up a lot of information, and it has a couple of buttons that offer us fixes. We'll come back to this in a second. So with these red errors, if I hit the play button, it'll build it, it won't run it, and it'll just tell me build failed. Because this is a serious enough issue that it's not going to run on a person's device. So Swift won't even let me put this on a user's device or even in the simulator to try it out. Now, if we do shorten things down a bit, if I tap on it now, it'll show me the whole text. But again, there's no fix button here for function is unused. So how do we fix this one? Well, this is just telling me function is unused is something that's going to happen if we are missing these parentheses. We're going to learn a lot about functions in the next unit. Unit 2, there's a whole lesson on functions that does an amazing job building up all the different ways that we can use functions, from the very simple start to super complex and really sophisticated. But in this case, what we can do to use a function is add the parentheses at the end, just like was mentioned in the chat. So excellent. So we've gotten rid of one error. If I hit the play button, I still can't run this in the simulator because I need to fix this issue here. And this, if I read this as a new programmer, I might instantly, my eyes are going to glaze over it. And I'm going to be like, what on earth is happening here? Value of optional type UI navigation controller. And there's a question mark, must be unwrapped. Oof. Well, luckily in this case, we've got a couple ways to fix this. You could chain the optional using question mark. The nice thing is that by the time we're done with developing Swift fundamentals, all of this stuff that looks like gibberish right now to beginning programmers will know exactly what it means. But if I hit fix, it inserts a question mark for me. Again, we'll learn about that in optional chaining in lesson in unit 3, lesson 1, optionals. But for now, that seems to have cleared up our errors. So if I hit the play button, it'll say build succeeded. It'll launch the iPhone simulator, and we're good to go. Still not very exciting, not a very exciting app. So those are two issues that we can run into in Xcode. There's errors where we can't build and run it. There's warnings where we can still build and run it, but it's something that we should probably fix, that Swift is just giving us advice on. The last type of issue we can run into in Xcode and in our code is runtime errors or bugs. So we're going to write a bit of code, and you can follow along. And if you are following along, I'll paste this into the chat. Oops. We'll pick the names that they have in the book. You can see as I'm typing, this is why I love Xcode. Using the autocomplete, I don't have to type everything out. I can just use my arrows to get around this autocomplete menu. We're going to do names.remove first, and then we'll do it again. So I'm going to paste this into the chat. So if you are following along, you can paste this in. This is what I would do for my students. So right now, if we read this code here, even if we're beginning programmers, we can guess that there might be an issue here. Can anyone tell me what the issue might be with this code right here that we just wrote? And I'll explain a little bit. The first line is basically just, it kind of looks like, we have a variable called names. And then inside the square brackets, we have just a list of names that we're going to store. And on names, we have this really handy method called remove first that'll just take the first thing, just like as if it were a drawer full of stuff. It would take the first thing out, remove it, and then remove first. What is the issue with this code that you can spot that Swift can't? Excellent. Runtime error, out of index. Not sure there are enough items to remove. Because if we were doing this exercise ourselves and we had a hat full of names, 2 names, and we did remove first, we'd take out Tammy or Cole, and then we'd remove the next, we'd take out the other one, and then what would happen when we tried to remove the third? We don't know. Well, that's not a good thing in programming. So I'm going to show you a really cool way, though, we can help debug issues like this. So if I hit the play button, the build succeeds, the simulator launches, and then I'm immediately flown back to Xcode. And I see a red line, kind of like what I saw with the other errors I had. And it's telling me fatal error, can't remove first element from an empty collection. Well, that doesn't sound very good. Fatal error sounds pretty bad. So what happened? Well, we have some stuff over here. We can kind of tap through this. This is our debug hierarchy, where we can see where in the call stack we got stopped. But to help me debug something like this, Xcode has an amazing tool built in called a debugger, where we can tap on the line number gutter over here, and it adds this blue bookmark. Now, this doesn't help us right now because our app is dead in the water. But if we hit the play button again, the same thing happens. The simulator launches, and then it kicks me back to Xcode. But this time, instead of red line, we get a green, and it tells me that it stopped at this breakpoint. And we can see below that we've actually got a few things. We've got names, we've got self that we won't go into too much. But I've got these buttons over here that I can use to navigate through my code. So this, if I hit the play pause button, if I hit that, that'll just continue running. I'll run into the same bug. It'll crash again. It'll throw me back to Xcode. These are the buttons we will use the most when we're debugging. This one steps over line by line. So it'll have Swift evaluate this line and then step to the next one and pause there. If we had more complex code, this would step into a function that we'll learn a little bit more about in Unit 2. And then when we do step into a function and inspect the code inside that function, we can use step out to jump back out of the function. So I'm going to use this step over button. So when I do that, it's now evaluated this line, and names, instead of having 0 values, now says 2 values, and it's Tammy and Cole in there, 0 and 1. And I haven't run this yet. I haven't done remove first yet. So I'll hit the step over button. And I can see that names has changed to have just 1 value in it. Tammy's been taken out. Now I just have Cole left behind. If I hit the step over button again, now I can see that names has 0 values, and I haven't run this line yet. So this can help. This is a simplified example, but this can help you identify where things have gone wrong and what happens just before the error happened. So if I hit step over again, it turns from green to red. That's where our fatal error happened. Maybe now this can't remove first element makes a bit more sense. So we can fix that by saying, oh, do you know what? We removed that too many times. We'll remove it, hit the play pause button. It'll still stop there because we haven't disabled our breakpoint, which we can do by just tapping on the line, or we can drag it off to get rid of it. We can still step through, or we can just hit the play pause button and everything's working just fine. Our very unexciting application is working without crashing. So that's a quick tour of some of the amazing tools that we have available to us. It's useful to use that debugger when you're actually doing a demo because it slows things way down. And it's also really helpful to walk through anything. If you see any weird error message, like we had the XPC error, when we couldn't launch the simulator. Talk through your students, what's going on. You may get the message that says, oh, you can't write this file. Do you want to resave it or close it? Don't just quickly click on stuff that you might do when you're developing. Just pause for a second and explain. And if you don't know what it is, but you have something you normally do to handle that situation, talk us through what you do and why you do it. Maybe you're just like, it seems to work. I'm not sure why. That's okay too. Just so long as you're explaining it for your students and not just dismissing it. Because if you do just dismiss it quickly, they might run into the same situation themselves later and go, oh, I mean, my teacher did that earlier. I'm not sure why. They just did it. So it's helpful to show them all these kind of tips and tricks that you've learned and just kind of understand now because you've been doing this for a while. Okay. So that is a very quick tour of two lessons, two different types of lessons. One using Xcode, one with just the slides and a little bit of Xcode. If you're doing some of the lessons, you don't have to jump out to Xcode. And if you have any questions about things that you should or shouldn't be using, definitely feel free to ask. I'm more than happy to give you advice on how to present some of these lessons. Okay, we'll have a quick look at the board. So what we're going to do, we're going to take a little, just 10-minute break so you can kind of get up, walk around, get a cup of tea. When we come back, we are going to be not in that. We are going to be in this thing here. Helps if I grab the right thing. We're going to take a little break. Actually, we're roughly on time. At about 9:45 here, we're going to come back and do an infrastructure check. That means you're going to show your welcome keynote presentation. So if you haven't downloaded that already, I would definitely take the break to download it. Think about what you're going to say. I want to hear about where you're coming from, because we're across, I think, 8 different time zones now, or 6 at least. I want to hear who you're teaching, what your background is with Swift. Just get to know you a little bit. And then once we're through those welcome keynote presentations, make sure that everybody's connection is good and we can hear you and see you. Then we'll take another little break before getting into our teachbacks, and we'll be going through this list in order for the rest of the week. Thankfully, I will be talking a lot less. Let me put up the return in. So we'll be back. What time is it? We'll be back at 9:45 here and in Nigeria, and the rest here. I think we've got everybody's time zones represented. And we'll be going through our welcome keynote presentations in the order that you see there, top to bottom. And we'll see you soon. Any questions before we head off? All right, so we'll see you in about 15 minutes.